Welcome to another dive into mysteries that defy logic and courage. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any secrets revealed. I also want to know where you're watching from. Leave your city or country in the comments. Today, we're going to explore the Winchester family's Mansion of the Damned, a place full of enigmas, corridors that defy time, and secrets that can forever change the lives of those who dare to enter. Are you ready to discover what lies behind its walls? The mansion stood like an ancient wound atop San Jose Hill in California, surrounded by gnarled trees and gardens that seemed to grow without any logic. Its irregular towers, staircases that led nowhere, and doors that opened onto solid walls gave the building an almost delirious aspect, as if it had been conceived by someone who never wished to be understood. Officially, it was known as the Winchester Mansion. But among long-time residents and employees who never stayed long, it was known by another name, the house that wouldn't let anyone leave the same way. Ethan Caldwell arrived at the property on a grey morning, bringing with him more skepticism than curiosity. A renowned structural engineer, he had been hired to assess the mansion's safety following a series of anonymous complaints alleging imminent risks of collapse in certain wings. To Ethan, it seemed like just another eccentric job, the kind that arises when history, tourism, and superstition mix. Still, there was something in the air, an unsettling feeling that couldn't be explained by calculations or architectural plans. On the other side of the equation was Margaret Hale Margaret, the curator in charge of the property and a distant descendant of the Winchester family. Unlike Ethan, knew every winding corridor, every false door, every window facing the void. Margaret didn't see the mansion as a structural problem, but as a living legacy. Her greatest fear wasn't the physical collapse of the building, but the possibility that someone would finally dismantle the myth that sustained its existence. The conflict between the two wasn't expressed in words, but in actions. Ethan began to circulate around the mansion with measuring instruments, digital maps, and technical notes, marking unstable areas and recording construction inconsistencies. Margaret, in turn, always appeared at the most inconvenient moments, diverting the route, omitting information, or redirecting attention to safer tourist areas. Each of her interventions seemed calculated to delay the progress of the work. Meanwhile, the mansion reacted. Doors that Ethan swore he had left open would later be locked. Corridors he had traversed with ease seemed to lengthen, leading him to unexpected parts of the house. At one point, following a staircase to the second floor, he ended up in a windowless room, where the silence was so dense that his own footsteps sounded strange. There was no logical explanation for this being on the official blueprints. At night, when the mansion was closed to the public, the remaining staff avoided certain wings. Oliver Grant, the night watchman, never stayed near the East Wing for more than a few minutes, claiming that the place didn't like being watched. Naomi Brooks, the person in charge of maintenance, insisted that some repairs simply didn't hold up. Renovated walls would show cracks the following morning, as if the house rejected any attempt at correction. Ethan ignored the comments. For him, everything had a measurable cause. Still, he began to notice a disturbing pattern. The most unstable areas of the mansion coincided exactly with sections linked to past deaths in the Winchester family, accidents, suicides, and episodes never officially clarified. It was as if the past were imprinted on the very structure of the building. Margaret knew this, she always knew, and every step Ethan took toward a true understanding of the mansion represented a direct threat. Not just to the place, but to the silent pact that, according to old family stories, had been made to keep something contained there. She didn't need to say anything. She only needed to observe, correct routes, hide keys, delay reports. What Ethan didn't yet understand, and was beginning to feel, was that this job wasn't just about evaluating an old building. There was something wrong with the house's logic. something that didn't behave like inert matter. Every action of his seemed to provoke a subtle, almost organic reaction, as if the mansion were testing its limits. And on that first day, upon finding a newly opened door where before there had only been a wall, Ethan had the strange certainty that he had crossed an invisible boundary, a boundary that the mansion would never forgive. Over the following days, Ethan Caldwell came to understand that the mansion could not be analyzed as an ordinary building. The surrounding environment seemed to directly influence the behavior of the people who worked there. The routine was silent, almost ritualistic, as if each employee followed unwritten rules, learned more through observation than formal instruction. The main wing, open to tourists, maintained a controlled appearance. Well-positioned lights, explanatory plaques, and clearly marked corridors created the illusion of order. But just crossing a discreet door, often unmarked, was enough to abruptly change the atmosphere. The air became colder, denser, and the smell of old wood mingled with something metallic, difficult to define. In these sections, the mansion seemed older than it actually was, as if it carried superimposed layers of time. Margaret Hale moved through these spaces with an unsettling ease. She didn't consult maps or flashlights. Her steps were precise, even in corridors that intersected illogically. To visitors, Margaret was merely a diligent, polite, and reserved curator. To the staff, however, she was something more. The guardian of a fragile order, someone who knew exactly how far one could go and where one shouldn't tread. Little by little, Ethan began to observe her reactions. Whenever he approached certain wings, especially those built after earthquakes or rushed renovations, Margaret would appear with some practical justification: urgent documents, restricted areas, changes in the schedule. There was no direct confrontation, only restraint. Among the employees, one stood out. Caleb Morris Caleb, an archivist responsible for the Winchester family's old documents, was unlike the others and seemed torn between fascination and fear. His records included personal letters, rejected blueprints, incomplete diaries, and unsigned notes. Many of these documents mentioned architectural decisions made without logical explanation, justified only by dreams, premonitions, or spiritual guidance. Caleb never said this aloud. He simply carefully selected what he gave to Ethan, omitting entire pages under the pretext of poor preservation. Even so, small details slipped through. Repeated dates, symbols drawn in the margins, constant references to restless souls, and balance maintained by continuous expansion. The cultural landscape of the time the mansion was built was beginning to permeate the research. The late 19th century in the United States was marked by a collective fascination with spiritualism. Sabbaticals, communication with the dead, and beliefs in supernatural punishments were socially accepted, especially among wealthy families beset by tragedy. Ethan knew this only in theory, but there, inside the mansion, the past still seemed active. At night, when Ethan reviewed his provisional reports, he noticed flaws that didn't repeat themselves in a predictable way. Walls that appeared solid during the day exhibited slight vibrations after sunset. The sound of wind passing through cracks produced noises similar to footsteps. None of this was supernatural in itself, but together it created a constant atmosphere of alert. The secondary characters also bore invisible marks. Lydia Turner, a veteran tour guide, she never led groups through certain corridors after midday. Samuel Reed, the restorer, refused to work alone and avoided using power tools in certain rooms, citing frequent interference. Each behavior reinforced the feeling that the mansion imposed its own limits. Ethan was beginning to realize that he wasn't just an outside observer. The house reacted to his presence gradually, almost strategically. The more he understood the structural logic, the more inconsistencies emerged that weren't recorded in any official document. It was as if the building had been designed to be deciphered only up to a certain point. Margaret watched everything from a distance, maintaining her serene demeanor. She knew the danger lay not in initial curiosity, but in the moment someone began to connect the fragments. And Ethan was dangerously close to that. The mansion was not merely a historical setting, it was a complex system, shaped by beliefs, losses, and decisions made under fear, a place where the past still influenced the present, and where any attempt at complete understanding could exact too high a price. From the second week onward, Ethan Caldwell's work ceased to be merely technical. The mansion seemed to react more and more directly to his interventions, as if each mark made on his maps awakened a silent resistance. It wasn't something visible or immediate, but a succession of small incidents that, added together, created a pattern that was difficult to ignore. The first concrete sign appeared when a beam in the north wing, considered stable in 3 consecutive inspections, showed a deep crack during the early morning hours. There had been no earthquake, nor significant climate change. Still, the wood had given way cleanly, as if it had been forced from the inside out. Ethan recalculated, reviewed measurements, compared photographs. Nothing justified that failure. Margaret Hale treated the incident as an isolated event. She authorized the temporary closure of the wing, but imposed severe restrictions on access. Ethan objected, requesting a full analysis of the adjacent structure. In response, he received only partial permissions, always accompanied by a designated employee, surveillance disguised as protocol. These limitations did not prevent him from moving forward. On the contrary, they became a stimulus. Ethan began working outside of conventional hours, using secondary entrances and rarely frequented corridors. It was during these forays that he noticed something even more disturbing. Certain areas of the mansion did not maintain the same configuration from one day to the next. A staircase near the west wing, for example, appeared longer on Tuesday night. The number of steps had increased, although the incline remained the same. On another occasion, a room listed as a storage room appeared with a new side door, leading to a narrow corridor that was not listed in any old or recent records. The employees began to show clear signs of discomfort. Oliver Grant started requesting frequent shift changes. Lydia Turner avoided crossing paths with Ethan, as if she feared being associated with the changes. Caleb Morris, under pressure, ended up making a mistake. He handed Ethan an incomplete notebook, forgetting to remove a loose page. Inside, there was an account dated 1901, written by a woman whose name had been repeatedly redacted. The text described the feeling that the house heard and reacted to the intentions of those who walked through its corridors. Even more unsettling was the mention of renovations carried out not to correct flaws, but to appease presences. Ethan confronted Margaret with the document. He didn't demand mystical explanations, only historical consistency. Her reaction was immediate and revealing. For the first time, her controlled demeanor wavered. She picked up the paper with excessive firmness and ended the conversation under the pretext of preserving the archive. From that moment on, the conflict ceased to be silent. The mansion intensified its response. Doors slammed shut with enough force to shake the walls. Drafts of air suddenly surged, extinguishing lights and disorienting anyone in motion. One night, Ethan was trapped for nearly an hour in a hallway that seemed to fold in on itself, repeatedly leading him back to the same spot, despite walking in a straight line. When he finally managed to leave, he found Margaret waiting, as if she knew exactly where he would be. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. There were boundaries that should not be crossed. Ethan, however, had already crossed that line internally. His conflict was no longer just with Margaret or the mansion's management, but with the very logic that underpinned the place. Each new irregularity reinforced the idea that this building did not merely obey known physical laws. The supporting actors began to interfere directly in the conflict. Samuel Reed refused to continue the repairs and resigned. Naomi Brooks disappeared for an entire shift, returning disoriented and unable to explain where she had been. The work environment became unstable, tense, marked by prolonged silences and suspicious glances. The mansion didn't attack directly. It pressured, isolated, confused. It created situations that pitted people against each other, testing their convictions. Margaret tried to maintain control, but her authority began to crumble as more inexplicable events emerged. Ethan realized that the real conflict lay not in the physical structure of the house, but in the invisible pact that kept it functioning. And, as he continued his investigation, he threatened not only to expose old secrets, he threatened to shatter a balance built on fear, loss, and silence. As strange events accumulated, small parallel stories began to emerge, silently intertwining with the central conflict. None of them existed by chance. Every relationship, every secondary decision seemed to contribute to a growing state of instability, as if the mansion fed on these tensions. The first subplot gained momentum, with Caleb Morris consumed by guilt over having delivered the incomplete document. He began to act erratically. He avoided eye contact, reviewed files during the early hours of the morning, and always kept a backpack ready, like someone planning to leave at any moment. On one of those nights, Ethan found him in the file room, surrounded by open boxes. Caleb didn't explain his actions, but he allowed Ethan to examine the old records. Among torn blueprints and discarded reports, a disturbing pattern emerged. Whenever the mansion went for long periods without renovations or expansions, serious incidents occurred. Deaths, unexplained accidents, disappearances. It wasn't documented superstition. It was a chronological sequence that was hard to ignore. Another subplot involved Lydia. Turner Lydia's refusal to cross certain corridors began to make sense when Ethan discreetly followed her to a side door in the south wing. There, Lydia kept a small, makeshift altar hidden behind a wooden panel. There were no clear religious symbols, only personal objects left by former employees. Broken clocks, photographs, rusty keys. It was a silent gesture of respect or fear. The time pressure intensified when the state administration announced an independent structural audit, scheduled for 10 days later. If Ethan's reports were confirmed, significant parts of the mansion would be condemned, perhaps permanently. For Margaret, this represented more than a professional setback. It meant interrupting a cycle that she believed kept something contained. The most delicate subplot, however, involved Margaret herself. Ethan began to notice signs of weariness that she struggled to hide. Insomnia, lapses in attention, automatic responses. At one point he saw her leave a closed session at the mansion with her hands trembling slightly, as if she had just negotiated something invisible. Meanwhile, the mansion intensified its manifestations. Clocks stopped precisely at 3:17 a.m. Windows appeared open after having been sealed. Hammering sounds echoed in disused wings, suggesting ongoing renovations where no one was working. The building seemed to anticipate the audit, preparing itself in its own way. Ethan began to divide his time between technical analysis and human observation. The subplots were not distractions. They were pieces of the same mechanism. Caleb represented the weight of an unresolved past. Lydia, the attempt at silent appeasement. Margaret, the active link between tradition and restraint. The complexity increased when Ethan realized that the mansion reacted differently to each character. With some, it provoked fear. With others, confusion. With him, it seemed to test limits, offering access to new areas whenever he approached an uncomfortable truth. Time had become a common enemy. The audit was approaching. Employees were abandoning their posts, and Margaret faced external and internal pressures. There was no more room for hesitation. The subplots converged on a critical point, pushing everyone involved towards irreversible decisions. And amidst this tangle of secondary stories, one certainty solidified. The mansion wasn't just reacting, it was preparing. The breaking point didn't come during the audit or in a moment of direct confrontation. It arose in a silent early morning when the mansion seemed more awake than ever. Ethan Caldwell had returned alone after receiving a short, to-the-point anonymous message. "If you want to understand the house, come now." The number was unknown. Still, he didn't hesitate. Upon entering the West Wing, he immediately noticed that something had changed. The lights were on in sections that had always remained off. The air, once cold, was heavy, almost stifling. Each step produced a prolonged echo, as if the mansion amplified his presence. Following an intuitive sequence of corridors, guided more by feeling than by maps, Ethan arrived at a space that had never appeared in any record. A large, circular hall, supported by dark wooden columns covered in hand-carved markings. The floor was covered with almost faded symbols, repeated obsessively. In the center of the hall, Margaret Hale waited. She didn't seem surprised. Her posture was firm, but there was a deep weariness in her gaze. Without introductions, she revealed what had been kept silent for generations. The mansion hadn't been built merely as a residence or an architectural eccentricity. From the beginning, it was a mechanism of containment. Each expansion, each illogical corridor, each door without practical function had a specific purpose: dissipate energy, not spiritual in the common mystical sense, but something more diffuse, a collective manifestation of guilt, fear, and death accumulated over time. The Winchester family believed that by keeping the house in constant flux, they would prevent this force from concentrating in a single point. The real shock, however, came next. Margaret confessed that the role of guardian had never been symbolic. Someone needed to remain there, keeping the cycle active, observing, adjusting, yielding when necessary, and little by little, the house chose who would become part of that system. She herself had not inherited the role by blood, but by permanence. The mansion had accepted her. Before Ethan could react, the atmosphere responded. The columns vibrated slightly. A deep noise ran through the walls, like an ancient sigh. Margaret explained that the audit represented a direct threat. If the renovation stopped, if wings were closed off, the flow would be disrupted. And then came the final revelation. Ethan hadn't been drawn there by chance. His rationality, his insistence on understanding, his initial resistance to fear, all of this made him an ideal candidate. The mansion wasn't reacting to expel him, but to evaluate him. Every structural change was a direct response to his actions. Margaret didn't beg. She simply informed her. Soon she wouldn't be able to maintain the relationship alone. The household would require another point of equilibrium. Someone willing to stay, even without understanding everything. Ethan's reaction wasn't one of panic, but of silent refusal. He stepped back, feeling the weight of the revelation more in his bones than in his mind. As he tried to leave, he realized that the way back didn't correspond to the way in. Doors appeared where there had once been walls, corridors narrowed. The mansion didn't physically confine him. It offered limited choices. When he finally reached the exit, the sky was already beginning to lighten. Margaret remained behind, motionless, blending into the dimness of the hall. Ethan left certain that none of this could be included in a technical report. The turning point had been reached. The story was no longer about assessing an ancient building. It was about deciding whether the acquired knowledge would be enough to endure, or whether the mansion had already chosen its next guardian. After the night spent in the hidden room, nothing returned to normal. Ethan Caldwell continued to frequent the mansion, but his presence took on a different weight. The corridors seemed less hostile, almost indifferent, as if the house had already registered his provisional decision not to accept, yet, the role that had been suggested to him. Margaret Hale, in turn, became more distant. She avoided direct encounters, delegated tasks, and began spending long periods in areas closed to the public. The serenity that had previously underpinned her authority began to crumble. Small mistakes emerged, permissions granted in error, schedules mixed up, forgotten areas left open at night. It was as if her connection to the mansion was weakening. The consequences spread quickly among the staff. Caleb Morris requested indefinite leave, citing health problems. Before leaving, he left Ethan a sealed box containing copies of old documents, including records of previous caretakers, people who had remained at the mansion until they gradually disappeared from public life. There were no death certificates, only administrative silences. Lydia Turner removed her makeshift altar after a disturbing incident. Upon returning to collect her belongings, she found them neatly rearranged, as if someone or something had decided for her. The following morning, she requested an immediate transfer, refusing to offer any explanation. Meanwhile, the mansion intensified its effects on the environment. Visitor traffic plummeted after reports of disorientation, unexplained falls, and recurring electrical failures. The state audit was postponed after one of the outside engineers suffered a nervous breakdown inside the East Wing, unable to explain what triggered his panic. Ethan tried to regain control through practical actions. He drafted neutral technical reports, avoiding any mention of unverifiable events. Away from the mansion, however, he began to feel the more subtle consequences. Recurring dreams of corridors rearranging themselves, sensations of displacement when entering ordinary buildings, a persistent discomfort when remaining in static spaces for extended periods. The most unsettling reaction came from within the mansion itself. During quick inspections, Ethan noticed that previously unstable areas had stabilized without any intervention. Conversely, sectors considered safe began to exhibit unexpected failures. The balance was being redistributed. Margaret finally sought out Ethan, not to convince him, but to inform him. The mansion was in transition. His initial resistance had created a loophole in the system. If no one assumed the role of containment, the house would find another way to adjust, possibly violently. The conversation was brief, devoid of emotional appeals. Margaret wasn't asking for help, she was stating facts. Her own health was beginning to deteriorate. Tremors, memory lapses, episodes of disorientation. The house demanded more than she could offer. The reactions weren't dramatic, but cumulative. Each departure, each structural failure, each visitor who didn't return created a scenario of progressive emptiness. The mansion didn't need to expel anyone. It simply needed to make their stay unbearable. Ethan understood that his refusal was not neutral. It generated consequences that spread silently, affecting everyone around him. The conflict was now both internal and external. To remain aloof meant allowing the system to collapse. To accept meant disappearing in another form. The tipping point had passed. All that remained was to deal with what it had unleashed. Ethan Caldwell understood that he could no longer react solely defensively. The mansion was no longer an external problem to be analyzed, but a system of which he was a part, albeit reluctantly. Overcoming this didn't come as a sudden heroic gesture, but as a silent change in attitude. He began with what he knew best: method. Instead of trying to fix the mansion, he began to observe it without direct interference. He walked through the corridors without instruments, without maps, without clear objectives. He simply recorded mental patterns, times when certain areas became accessible, subtle changes in acoustics, the physical sensation of resistance or fluidity in certain sections. For the first time, he wasn't trying to impose logic, he was trying to recognize it. This change had an immediate effect. The mansion ceased to create explicit obstacles in his presence. Doors no longer slammed shut. Staircases maintained their full length. It wasn't welcoming, but tolerance. Meanwhile, Ethan began to act outside the physical space of the house. He cancelled the final delivery of the reports to the state auditors, assuming full technical responsibility for the delay. He knew this would compromise his professional reputation, but he understood that the premature exposure of the mansion would cause irreversible damage. This decision marked a clear turning point. For the first time, he chose to withhold information instead of revealing it. Margaret Hale watched from a distance. She didn't interfere, but she noticed the change. Ethan began making decisions that had previously been hers. He redistributed shifts, drastically reduced the number of employees, and isolated critical wards without public justification. Each action lessened the pressure on the house and on Margaret. Overcoming challenges also required personal sacrifices. Ethan distanced himself from outside contacts, refused new contracts, and interrupted side projects. His world began to narrow in a controlled way, not imposed by the mansion, but by conscious choice. He accepted limitations as part of the necessary balance. The mansion responded subtly. New spaces became accessible without resistance. An old, blocked corridor revealed a simple, symbolless observation room where outside sound was barely perceptible. Ethan began to use the place as a point of reference, not as a control center, but as an anchor. Ethan's growth wasn't marked by spectacular courage, but by adaptation. He stopped confronting and started negotiating, not with words, but with his presence. His constant, predictable and unchallenging presence created a stable pattern that the mansion recognized. Margaret, on the other hand, began to retreat. She gradually transferred responsibilities, took longer absences, and accepted, without question, decisions she would have previously contested. Her role was being replaced not by imposition, but by natural attrition. The system was finding a new foothold. The most revealing moment occurred when Ethan realized he no longer felt disoriented outside the mansion. Ordinary buildings once again seemed static, predictable. The discomfort that had previously accompanied him had dissipated, a sign that his adaptation was not consuming his identity, but redefining its boundaries. He didn't see himself as a guardian. He still resisted the label. But his actions showed something different, someone who had learned to maintain a balance without needing to fully understand it. Overcoming the challenge in that context wasn't about conquering the mansion or escaping it. It was about remaining there without getting lost. And for the first time since his arrival, Ethan had a clear feeling that this was possible. The stability Ethan Caldwell had achieved proved temporary. The mansion couldn't withstand the immobility for long. Small signs began to indicate that a bigger adjustment was approaching, not due to failure, but out of necessity. The isolated areas began to show coordinated changes. Doors that had been sealed appeared unlocked at dawn. Corridors aligned more directly, reducing the labyrinthine feeling. The house wasn't expanding, it was reorganizing itself. For Ethan, this meant only one thing: the system was preparing for a definitive transition. The remaining subplots began to wrap up. Caleb Morris sent one last short message informing them that he had left the state. The files he had taken with him were returned digitally, accompanied by a simple note: "Now you have everything." There were no more hidden fragments of the past, at least not in human records. Lydia Turner never returned. Her transfer request was approved without question. The makeshift altar remained dismantled, and the space behind the panel was sealed off by the mansion itself, as if acknowledging that such a gesture was no longer necessary. Margaret Hale became almost invisible. She spent entire days away from the property and, when she did appear, she merely observed from a distance. Her presence no longer provoked any reaction in the house. The bond was dissolving definitively. External pressure, however, was mounting. The State Audit Office rescheduled the inspection for a near-term, definitive date. This time, there would be no postponements. Ethan knew that, regardless of his stance, the final confrontation could not be avoided. He intensified his preparation in a practical way. He created fixed circulation routes, established observation points, and reduced the mansion to a minimal set of functional areas. Each decision eliminated variables and concentrated the internal flow. It was not an attempt at control, but at clarity. The mansion responded by simplifying even further. The noises ceased almost completely. There were no footsteps, no invisible hammering. The silence was continuous, dense, heavy with expectation. For Ethan, this was more unsettling than the previous chaos. The night before the audit, Ethan walked through the house without haste. The paths were straightforward, almost conventional. The circular room where everything had changed remained accessible, now without resistance. Margaret wasn't there, nor were there any active symbols, just empty space, waiting. Ethan understood that the climax would not be an explosive event, but an irreversible choice. The mansion would not explicitly demand anything. It would simply adjust to the decision made, or the lack thereof. The outside environment began to reflect this tension. The weather turned, the wind ceased, and a feeling of suspension hung over the property, as if time had slowed down, awaiting a single movement. All the pieces were in place, the subplots had been resolved, the past was documented, the present stabilized, the future undefined. There were no distractions or narrative detours left. The preparations were complete, the mansion was ready, and Ethan too. The morning of the audit arrived silently. Ethan Caldwell awaited the outside team, but quickly realized there would be no conventional inspection. The cars parked outside seemed to have vanished from view, as if the mansion had bent reality around it. A corridor that should have led to the main entrance now curved in an impossibly dangerous way, taking him to an unknown point on the property. Margaret Hale appeared for the last time, her posture neutral but firm. She said nothing. She merely observed as Ethan took the initiative. He knew he could no longer escape what the mansion demanded. His final choice had to be made there, in that space where the past and the present met. The circular hall, the epicenter of the house, revealed itself once more. The columns, once covered in symbols, were now clean. The floor displayed only simple geometric patterns, but vibrated slightly beneath Ethan's feet. The mansion seemed to contain him with silent patience, testing his resolve. What followed was not a physical confrontation, but a mental one. Every corridor walked previously, every door that opened or closed, every breath became a reminder of the choices made and their consequences. Ethan realized that the mansion did not wish to destroy him. It only sought a resolution, someone who could sustain the balance that Margaret could no longer maintain. He walked to the center of the hall, feeling the weight of generations on his shoulders. The transformation wasn't heroic or dramatic. It was silent, almost imperceptible. He stopped reacting instinctively to his surroundings and began to move with intention, respecting the standards imposed by the house, but without losing her own conscience. Every gesture was an act of understanding and acceptance. Then the unexpected happened. The mansion, which for centuries had shaped corridors and doorways to confuse, began to reorganize itself before Ethan. Stairs appeared logically, locked doors opened, and the heavy air became breathable. The building seemed to recognize him as an active participant, not just a visitor. Margaret, who was still present, finally spoke. "You understand now, Ethan. It's not strength or courage, it's presence. Accept it or let another point emerge. But the cycle cannot be broken." Ethan understood. He didn't need to sacrifice himself, but he needed to assume conscious responsibility. The transformation of his attitude, the adaptation of his actions, and the understanding of the system were enough to keep the mansion in balance without being consumed by it. The final twist came when Ethan decided to walk through the corridors that were once labyrinthine and unpredictable. This time, each path led exactly where it should, not by magic, but by aligning his intention with the flow of the mansion. The chaos ceased to exist because someone had finally learned to read the logic of the house, not to control it, but to coexist with it. The mansion responded in a unique way. Small tremors ceased, doors remained stable. The wind that had previously blown unexpectedly through the corridors vanished. The space became predictable, but not static. Ethan could move freely, without interfering, without being interfered with. The transformation had not been about power, but about respect and understanding. In the final instant, the last door of the hall opened by itself, leading Ethan out directly to the outer garden, illuminated by the soft light of dusk. There, Margaret remained only as a silent spectator. She no longer controlled the mansion. The role had been transferred, but in a different way than expected. Ethan had not become an imprisoned guardian, but a conscious intermediary, capable of finding balance without sacrificing. As he walked through the garden, he felt for the first time that the weight of generations, failures, and secrets no longer oppressed him. He had accepted what he needed to accept, learned what he needed to learn, and found a balance that kept the mansion safe without losing his own humanity. The mansion, now seemingly at peace, revealed no more immediate mysteries. But the lingering feeling that his story wasn't completely over made it clear. Ethan had won the challenge, but he understood that surveillance would be ongoing, not as punishment, but as a conscious responsibility. The climax was resolved. The tension had reached its peak, the plot twist was plausible, and the protagonist had shown visible transformation. From a skeptical and analytical engineer, Ethan had evolved into someone capable of understanding and living with the unknown without losing himself. In the days following the climax, the Mansion of the Damned presented a surprising calm. To visitors, it seemed like a normal historical property, though still surrounded by rumors of its strangeness and the unsettling aura that hung over its corridors. But for Ethan Caldwell, the reality was more complex. He carried with him the awareness that the mansion was not yet predictable, only balanced, and that maintaining this balance would require constant attention, observation, and respect for what lay beyond conventional understanding. Margaret Hale disappeared from the property for good, returning only to lock rooms and deliver essential documents. Her role as guardian had been indirectly transferred. Ethan had not become a captive, but someone capable of coexist with the mansion by taking responsibility without sacrificing her own life. She, in stepping away, conveyed a silent message. The cycle would continue, but with new parameters, and the future was no longer defined by fear, but by conscious choice. The remaining employees reorganized their roles. Caleb Morris had left, but the digitized material he left behind allowed Ethan to understand the mansion's complete history, its secrets, and the patterns that governed its operation. Lydia Turner and Samuel Reed remained aloof, relieved not to have to directly confront the house, but aware that Ethan now occupied a central role, unlike any previous one. Externally, the mansion maintained its imposing and traditional appearance. Visitors reported only minor sensations of discomfort, subtle drafts, slightly prolonged echoes that did not interfere with the experience. To the outside public, it seemed that the story had safely concluded. But for Ethan, each step through the corridors carried the same silent weight, a constant reminder that he was participating in something that transcended common logic. The protagonist also experienced visible internal changes. His perception of danger became more refined. He learned to interpret subtle signs, to make decisions based on observation and not just technical analysis. He no longer saw the mansion as an enemy, but as an entity to be respected. The self-confidence he developed allowed him to not need to control every detail, recognizing limits and accepting the unknown. The emotional closure came from small, everyday actions. Walking through the corridors, watching the light filter through the old windows, Ethan felt a mixture of fascination and serenity. He knew the mansion wouldn't reveal all its secrets, but that this was no longer a threat, but rather an invitation to conscious coexistence. The narrative's conclusion solidified the arc. The central conflict was resolved, the subplots were wrapped up, and the protagonist's transformation became clear and plausible. The reader perceives the natural consequence of Ethan's choices and how each character reacted to the changes, establishing internal and emotional coherence. The Mansion of Condemned Souls continued to exist, now as a balanced space, protected not only by architecture or historical documents, but by the understanding, observation, and responsibility of those who inhabited it. Months later, Ethan Caldwell still walked through the mansion daily. Although the apparent chaos had ceased, small signs reminded him that the house never truly slept. Doors creaking on their own, shadows lingering in the farthest corners, the whisper of the wind at unexpected hours. He learned to observe without intervening, to walk without altering the flow, aware that the balance was fragile. The Mansion of the Condemned Souls remained alive, breathing at its own pace, and Ethan knew that as long as someone was paying attention, the story that had begun there generations ago would not end. It would only transform. If you were surprised by the secrets of the Mansion of Condemned Souls, share this story with friends and family who appreciate historical mysteries and enigmas. Leave your theories in the comments about what Ethan really discovered and how he will manage to maintain the balance of the mansion. Every detail can have multiple interpretations, and your perspective may reveal aspects that went unnoticed. Don't forget to follow future stories, where mystery, suspense, and the complexity of the human mind intertwine, always challenging our certainties. The Mansion of Condemned Souls lives on, and you are part of